a court ruling in Alberta is raising a much bigger national question. If a province wants to separate, who actually gets a say? And what does that mean for Quebec? So what are we talking about? Well, an Alberta court signals Indigenous consultation is required in any separation efforts. It raises constitutional implications beyond Alberta, and it puts quiet pressure on Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon and the Parti Québécois. Well, why? Well, there's the legal precedent. Consultation with First Nations now central to separation efforts. Potential standard, not just Alberta, but for Quebec as well. So would Quebec face the same requirements in a future referendum? And does it move the sovereignty debate beyond Quebec versus Ottawa? And does consultation imply influence or a potential veto? Wow. And no clear response from PSPP so far. Well, fill you in more on that in a moment. Strategic silence or unresolved position. So why does this all matter? Well, it redefines how separation would work in Canada. It introduces Indigenous rights as a central constitutional factor. So, Eddie, let's get into this. First of all, we did reach out to the Parti Québécois and Plamondon to appear on the program tonight. And in fairness, I sent an email yesterday because of the holiday weekend, and yes, it was a short time spent. Received an automated response that the email had been received. I said, I understand, that he may not be able to come on tonight. At the very least, would you please furnish a statement from your leader as to where he stands on this Alberta court ruling? Because I can't really find anything where he's made any solid statement on it. And as of 7:05 Eastern, we are still waiting for either a yes or no on his appearance. So I guess we take a hard no on that one. And right. We have not received a statement. We offered, and it was not taken this time around anyway. Perhaps the next time. So there are a couple of things when you get into this and it's changing in Alberta as we speak, because there's a legislative committee meeting, and the meeting may be over. I don't know. I haven't had a chance to check on it yet. But they're trying to decide what to recommend, whether a question of separation be put on the October referendum that Danielle Smith, the Premier, is planning on holding, or whether it's a question of, do you want to stay in Canada? And you may remember Thomas Lukasik was on our program earlier this year. He was the one, Freedom Canada, Fight for Freedom Canada, and keeping Alberta in Confederation. And so his question, as you may recall, he said we wanted it to go to the legislature to be debated and a motion coming out of the legislature. Well, this legislative committee is now studying it, and this is one of the recommendations that the committee could make. And as a matter of fact, around 5 o'clock this afternoon, they did send out a news release saying that that was going to be the recommendation. However, it seems that the committee was still meeting. And about 15 minutes later, they sent out another release saying that first one was sent in error and that the debate was still underway. And I have not had any updates yet as to what question is going on. But Premier Smith tomorrow, she has 2 senior cabinet ministers who announced that they were resigning today and they will not be reoffering. So she has a cabinet shuffle to deal with tomorrow. And also, it's widely speculated that she's going to address the province tomorrow night on the whole issue. Meantime, the separatist movement in Alberta says, we're looking at appealing the ruling that came out of the Alberta courts last week, which says, you talk about separation all you want, essentially, but until you sit down and talk with the First Nations people, it's not going to happen. And it's just been like, okay, one thing after another. And it's as everybody has said quietly overall, whether we're talking Quebec or Alberta, you don't vote and say, yes, we're separating. It doesn't happen the next day. It doesn't happen the next week. It doesn't happen the next month. You're lucky if it happens 3 or 4 years later down the road that you're even close to actually separating from the country, because it's going to take that long to work through all of the constitutional hassles and everything else. And some of the separatists in Quebec, including one of the leaders, was saying, oh no, we'll have it done in a year.
Yeah.
When have you ever seen legal beagles sitting around a boardroom table debating and arguing and going through things, especially constitutional items,
yeah,
and getting it done in a year? That's not going to happen.
Unless they're just, I mean, I can't see anything happening within a year, Gary. And unless they're, the Quebec government at that time is going to take a position of, well, we're doing it, we don't need you, Canada. And that's it. We don't care about your lawyers. We're our own country. Okay, fair play. However, you don't want to go on and start calling leaders and provinces treasonous. But I mean, this borders on treason by not following the rule of law to engage in a sort of separation of a province from the rest of the country. I mean, there's a due process for that. I mean, which is, I think, a good thing that there is a process for it, and it allows for a release of Alberta and an out for this to continue rolling down the track for 3 or 4 years till separation, or God knows, maybe they're going to reverse their decision once cooler heads prevail. But anyway, I mean, just making a slash cut, we're no longer part of Canada. I would imagine there are going to be consequences and repercussions to that, meaning you're no longer going to be using our Canadian dollar. Throw your passports in the garbage and all kinds of other wonderful things that will get in the way. So this whole thing about telling the population of Quebec that it's only going to take a year, you want to talk about fantasy and just lying right through your teeth. As a prime example of how not to run a democracy, that statement in itself is an example.
Well, the Parti Québécois has already said that when they take Quebec out of Confederation, that they will have their own currency. That one.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember anybody ever talking about asking Canada if they could keep the Canadian dollar. So
yeah,
and in Alberta today, there was somebody brought up the fact, well, we don't even know if we'd be able to keep our Canadian passports or use our Canadian. No, if you leave, you're going as your own country. You're not going to use Canadian passports. No,
yeah.
That's just not on the table. So let's talk a little bit more. I did a little bit of research, and a couple of things I came up with. An appeal of the Alberta ruling appears very likely, and in fact, Premier Danielle Smith has already publicly said the province intends to appeal the ruling. Now, it came from the Alberta Court of King's Bench, and a justice there found Alberta had a constitutional duty to consult First Nations before allowing the separatist referendum petition process to proceed, because Alberta's separation could directly affect Treaty 7 and Treaty 8 rights. And the key points in the judgment: treaty relationships predate Alberta itself. That made sense when I read that. Separation would alter the constitutional framework affecting those treaties. Therefore, consultation obligations are triggered early in the process, not only after a referendum succeeds. Now, Smith says the ruling's incorrect in law and anti-democratic, and said the government would challenge it. Lawyers connected to the separatist movement also indicated they believe the decision contains significant legal errors and are expected to support appeals as well. What's not clear is whether the appeal has formally been filed. I don't think it has. Whether Alberta itself or only separatist groups will be appellants. I think you may see the separatist groups tag on the province's lawsuit. It might be a little bit cheaper that way. And whether appellate courts will agree that consultation duties arise at the petition stage rather than later during actual constitutional negotiations. And the last issue is probably where the real legal battle is headed, because Alberta argued in court that consultation would only become necessary if separation actually moved toward implementation. First Nations argued the referendum process itself already threatens treaty rights. So, how does it play in Quebec? Okay, as we said, the reaction from Quebec sovereigntists has been noticeably cautious and relatively quiet. Nobody serious in modern Quebec sovereignty wants to casually walk into a legal framework that suddenly gives Indigenous nations a potentially central constitutional role in any future separation process. And that's very different from back in 1980 and 1995 referendums. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, we've not seen major figures like PSPP or anybody from the CAC camp loudly declaring this ruling doesn't apply to Quebec. Yeah, usually they're first out of the gate. And that silence is probably deliberate. The reason? Quebec separatists have spent decades arguing Quebec forms a distinct nation within Canada, but Indigenous nations can now point back and say, fine, we are nations too. And our treaties or territorial rights cannot simply be overridden by a provincial referendum. And that's no longer hypothetical with that Alberta ruling. So, Quebec's situation is legally different from Alberta in some other important ways. Alberta is almost entirely covered by numbered treaties. Quebec has a more mixed legal and territorial history. Northern Quebec includes major agreements like the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, rather than the Prairie Treaty Framework. So, some legal types have commented. The discussion has pointed out Quebec may not be as exposed as Alberta because far less of Quebec is treaty land in the prairie sense, but it doesn't mean Quebec can simply ignore Indigenous claims. And back in 1995, I didn't realize this, but Cree and Inuit leaders in northern Quebec argued very clearly that if Quebec could secede from Canada, they could also choose not to leave Canada with Quebec. The Cree even held their own referendum and overwhelmingly voted to remain in Canada. So that unresolved question never really disappeared, and the Alberta ruling just dragged it back into the spotlight. Politically, Quebec sovereigntists are probably aware of a dangerous optics problem here. If they respond with Quebec nationhood matters, but Indigenous nationhood does not, that becomes a very awkward position in modern Canada, especially internationally.
Well, they got to be so careful. I mean, Plamondon has to be walking on eggshells right now, along with the CAC. Yep. Because, look, in the last two referendums, let's call a spade. There was a significant amount of Francophone voters on the referendums that voted to say no, we want to stay in Canada. And you know what? He strategically has to be very important that he doesn't step on that particular undecided vote amongst the Francophone population, or whoever else is going to be voting here as a citizen of Quebec and voting in the referendum. And he also has to be very careful in terms of what he says to the First Nations people of Quebec, and like you said, out west, they're essentially saying, no, I don't think so. We have to be involved in this discussion before even a referendum takes place, and you have to look at. You mentioned that the Crees had their own referendum in 1995, and I think there was something like 92 or 93% voted to remain in Canada, if memory serves, something to that level. And you look at Quebec, which is different from the way treaties were signed in by any provincial treaties were signed in Alberta are quite different to what we have here in Quebec. And like from a strict legal reserve ownership in terms of property, it's about 1% of Quebec's territory. And then you have formal regional agreements, which is the majority of northern Quebec, which you mentioned, the James Bay and those kind of areas. And then you look at what the First Nations are determining as broader Indigenous ancestral territory claims. Gary, this is almost all of Quebec in itself. So there are three different territorial agreements, handshakes, understandings that the First Nations folks see as their defining ownership of their territories and claiming them to be Canadian, not Quebec. So you know what? I remember seeing all kinds of territorial maps being displayed from the last referendum, and it's incredible how much they're saying, well, this is our property in red, and Quebec, you can have this. I mean, it was staggering to see where most of the territory was native. Um, and in terms of today's politicians in Quebec pushing for not sovereignty but outright separation, Gary, you go back to the Oka crisis. This issue became very visible over sovereignty of their own lands, and a lot of that had to do with the Oka crisis that gained absolute national attention, and it actually gained attention on the international level as well.
Yes, it did.
This
Yep.
is the rights of the First Nations people in securing their ancestral territory for the sake of some real estate developer wanting to expand the golf course over their land. And look what ended up happening. I mean, this was a standoff of months. The Mercier Bridge here in Montreal was blocked. A major artery to the South Shore to Montreal was blocked. So you know what? The First Nations folks have clout, and they have demonstrated that they will not restrain themselves in terms of protecting their territory. So yeah, you know what? Alberta, Quebec, and any other province that's thinking about separation, you will not be permitted to just arbitrarily make a decision on behalf of the First Nations people as if they're just a voting citizen and they cast their vote. We're not talking about electing the leader of a province here anymore. You are speaking about taking over people's land, and it's been demonstrated the First Nations people, rightly so and proudly so, won't stand for that. So I can see that. I can hear that the silence is quite deafening from the political parties out in Alberta, but especially so far here in Quebec.
Oh, it has to give Plamondon and his group pause for concern and pause for thought, sober second thought in the way that this is going down. And there's a reason that the Indigenous people are called First Nations. They were here first.
Gary,
this was their land. This was their land. So anyway, yeah. I just wanted to come back quickly because this is, I thought, kind of an interesting point of view from Deborah, where she said, as a Quebecer, I don't mind saying that if we want to be separated from other provinces, we should try going without transfer payments for a while to see if we can make it on our own. And remember, who gets the largest... Yeah, exactly. And who gets the largest share of equalization payments in the country?
Yep.
So
you know how you know what? How about a trial run, Mr. Plamondon? Let's you know what? I'm open-minded. I think Deborah's claiming that she's open-minded. Let's give it a roll for a year and let's see how we do without Canada's money.
Exactly, and without any other support.
Yeah.
But it really makes sense, and it's right up there with some of the other arguments for and against. Like sometimes the separatists, doesn't matter if you're talking out west or here in Quebec, they approach it in such a simplistic form. And it's almost like, well, let's throw it out there. It's all going to settle the way that we want it to settle. It'll all be good. It's not going to be good. It's almost like you're giving birth to a new baby. It's not always easy. So I don't see how.
Or even if you just take the language laws out of the entire equation, which has been a problem from a business perspective for Quebec for decades now. Let's just take the language issue out of the picture and take the culture issues out of the equation. From running a province, typically you try to run a province as a business. Take all of that out of the equation. Can you run a sovereign nation with what you have today as with business ventures and secure business interests in the province of Quebec? We're struggling with it. We've done this for a long time, where we continue to struggle with international investment and not having secure governments in place that will encourage people to dump billions of dollars into this province nonchalantly. How will that play out if you do actually push for separation, and if you do succeed in separation? Are you going to be able to sustain yourself as an independent nation whilst monies from elsewhere are kind of waiting to see how things pan out before investing their monies here? It has nothing to do with culture. This has nothing to do with language. This comes down to people being able to put food on their tables, whether it's up in the regions, whether it's in the mid-sized cities in Quebec, or whether it's inside metropolitan areas of Montreal and Quebec City. You're playing with people's livelihood and lives here. It's not just a question of sacrifice for culture and a question of language, which I believe is very important culturally and linguistic-wise in this province. Province has spoken French since day one, and they continue to speak French, and that's never going to disappear. For the sake of language and culture, pushing that point to sacrifice the vitality or potential vitality of a province, that's kind of selfish thinking, and I don't know what they're after. If a CEO proposed that, a company did this, that, and the other thing and sacrificed money for the short term, how long do you think that CEO is going to hang around? Not very long.
Exactly.
He'll be heat-holed out in the sidewalk like this. So, that's just my perspective. Obviously, I'm a Canadian, proud Canadian with every province and territory in our confederation, and I will continue to be a supporter of that. But I'm trying to be as objective as possible and take that emotion away from it. I'm just thinking about it from a business perspective and what impacts Quebecers are going to feel as a result of A, pushing a separatist move and the consequences for that, and B, in fact, winning what's going to happen to this province. Forget about 10 years from now. What's going to happen to this province in a year?
Exactly.
And I like that for suggestion. You know what? You want to try this before you even have a separatist vote? Don't take Ottawa's money for a year. See how you do.
And I see another arrow being tossed, Monel suggesting Montreal could go its own way. And how many times have we mentioned a city-state over the last year and a half?
Yeah.
Which would be a tough go. But, when you look at what this city lost investment-wise, and given the state of the world now, even I can figure it out, and I'm no economic genius by any stretch of the imagination, far from it. But investors are looking for a safe place now to park their money. And if you have any kind of teetering back and forth on a question of separation, whether Alberta seems to think maybe that they're going to be clear of some of that because of the oil and natural resources they have, that's not going to be the case. That's not going to be the case. They're going to find that investors are going to just kind of keep them at arm's length and play very, very, very carefully. And here in Quebec, the same way, especially if a separate Quebec decides that it's going to continue pushing issues like language, trying to legislate culture instead of allowing culture to flourish on its own, a lot of companies are just going to say, we don't need all of this foolishness in dealing with,
Right.
the language police and all of everything that goes with that. We don't need it. So we'll just go elsewhere. And that's,
Yeah.
the whole thing's going to happen again. I don't understand why those who feel that Quebec can make it on its own and would be far better off, why they have not learned from the lessons of the past.
Yeah.
And 95 was probably the best lesson ever even between 95 and previous referendums, where you could see the trickle slowly heading to Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
And here you have the largest city in Canada at the time, now pushed down to number 2, and a lot of the financial district left for Toronto, and a lot of other big investment dollars left for Toronto. Why haven't those lessons been learned and taken to heart?
Interesting question.
That's me. So,
yeah. Well, Gary, about just a comment on Alberta. When oil prices just plummeted, remember all those years ago? I can't remember exactly what year it was or who the Prime Minister of Canada was at that time, where you were looking at towers in Calgary emptied because oil companies couldn't afford to A, keep their employees, B, keep drilling, and C, they because of the price of oil had dropped so bad because of what OPEC was doing. Didn't Alberta get handouts from Ottawa in order to keep them sustainable and viable until we overcame this problem with the drop in price per barrel for oil? Because I do remember Calgary was dying; they were struggling
yes,
just to keep their noses above water. So I guess the
that
point I'm
is a
trying to make here,
good
Gary, is
question.
you can't just rely on your entire viability and your lifeline to be oil. What happens if something happens to oil where your oil would be outpriced by God knows what, or if the price per barrel drops tremendously? I mean, of recent, that's going to be hard to come by because of what's going on in the Middle East. But you know what? One day things will stabilize again, and you just don't know. You can't put personally, I wouldn't put all my eggs in one basket and then hope that basket's going to always be fully intact and not develop holes in it. Then what? What are you going to go to then? And I'm not saying that Alberta's not vibrant in other sectors. I'm not saying that. But from what you hear online, what you hear on social media, what you hear on network television, and what you hear the politicians saying for years and years and years, we don't have to worry about anything else. We got oil. Well, if memory serves me, you ran into a big problem with oil some time ago, and you needed help. And that's fine. That's part of what being part of Canada is. If a province struggles, the federal government will jump in and try to help that province as much as they can. This is what being part of a confederation is. But yeah, I guess it just like you're wondering why Quebec has not learned from previous excursions to separating from the country and the devastation to the economy that brought on for decades. How come today's leaders in Quebec don't realize that and learn from that lesson? Then, by the same token, based on what we're hearing from the Alberta separatist movement, they're obviously not looking east to us to see the challenges we had with this and try to learn from it so they can prevent the same mistakes. And at the same time, yeah, don't worry about it. We got oil. We'll be fine. I think that's a horrible message to send to Albertans that are going to be going to the polls to decide whether they stay in the country or not. So I don't know, Gary. That's just me. Along with you, I just don't get that line of thinking, which doesn't sound It doesn't sound like good, sound business thinking, if you ask for my opinion.
Well, and let's not forget that the pipeline that has been at the center of discussions around the referendum in Alberta.
Mhm.
The Prime Minister came to town and worked with Premier Smith and got the memorandum of understanding, and it's moving forward. And now he's dealing with BC because Premier Eby is not happy.
Right.
However, on top of all that's lost in all of the political spats back and forth over the pipeline is the fact that there's still no private investment appearing willing to
Right.
invest in the pipeline. So if
Yeah.
private investment is not willing at this point to put the money on the table, what's the point of having all of this uproar over building the pipeline when you don't have a private proponent? What do you know? Like
True.
it doesn't make sense. The investment dollars aren't there, and the investment dollars aren't there. I would suggest part of the reason holding back the investment dollars because we both know that if they start pushing oil through that pipeline, it's going to be going across the Pacific into Asia, and there's a market over there for it. But private investors right now, there's too much uncertainty with all of this talk of a referendum and separation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So even I can figure that out.
Well, doesn't that make their dependence on oil more volatile? I mean, if they can't even find investors today where it's only a threat of talk of a referendum before they actually have it, separate and find out how much investment you're going to get at that point, which is even worse off. I mean, let's say this particular deal was done during the Trudeau era, 4 years ago, before the push for separation in Alberta really kicked off. Um, do you think there would have been more foreign investment? Maybe, I don't know. But to me, the writing looks like it's on the wall. And you're right. You just made me think of it, Gary. They're struggling to find somebody to invest in this pipeline now. What's that going to look like after you have your referendum, and what's that going to look like after you separate? Unless all of it's going to be American born, American based, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh boy.
Just a quick comment that popped up. My understanding is Alberta will build the pipeline.
Mhm.
And that may very well be the fact that the province will put up the seed money along with some money from Ottawa, but they are still talking about and looking for private investment, a proponent from the private sector for the pipeline. Otherwise, why build it at this point if there doesn't seem to be a market for it? However, Carney's doing what he can to show that we're trying to work with the West and in particular Alberta and keep them, address some of the complaints that they do have, and a lot of the complaints they have are legitimate. And for the first time, because for over a decade under Trudeau, there was no real discussion with the provinces, and nor any, especially with Western provinces, and in particularly in Alberta, the Trudeau government was hell bent on basically destroying what it could of the oil patch.
Right.
I get that. I totally understand where Alberta's really ticked off about. Talking about shutting down the oil patch, basically, but at the same time, the handout for the money coming to Ottawa for equalization payments, of which the largest chunk goes to Quebec, a province that's rich in resources, a lot of underdeveloped resources, taking a handout from the rest from Ottawa. I don't
Both
get
you and I
that.
get it. Yeah, exactly.
You know,
We
and
don't understand it.
all under the guise of here in Quebec social conscience. What the hell is social conscience
Yeah.
in this
And just a thought.
particular discussion? How does it
Yeah, and
really
you know,
relate?
right, exactly. And I was just thinking about Alberta. You know what? Tapping into the news every morning. Whenever I hear progress in discussions between Carney and Smith to enhance Alberta's oil capability, I am happy. I mean, I'm saying to myself, great. Finally, we're getting some really good progress here. This is going to be great for the province of Alberta, great for the people of Alberta. This is going to be great for Canada. And so you're looking at federal involvement, and as the last viewer mentioned, Alberta's paying for it as well. You know what? The perfect trifecta has to be a third party investor in this. That way, there is business interests governing how the money is being made and how the project moves forward in conjunction with provincial government and the federal government, as opposed to just government entities running this. Because both you and I know government projects run completely under government management and entities doesn't usually work out so well at the end of the day unless you have foreign investment involved. So we're two-thirds of the way there, and I think Smith and Carney continue working that two-thirds. And look, you have to keep the First Nations people involved. You have to keep British Columbia involved. So you're still looking for Ebby's buy-in on this, because to get to the Asian market, something has to happen across his province, and he's very protective of protecting the waters off the coast of BC because of the potential dangers of super tankers coming in towards BC shores, and get BC's buy-in and get that foreign investor. You know what that's going to do? It's going to make Alberta a huge powerhouse in the energy sector, and will make the Canadian government a larger powerhouse internationally in terms of our oil production capability. It'll potentially give monies to enhance refining capabilities here. I mean, it's the heavy bitumen oil that comes out of Alberta, out of the tar sands, and there are only certain products you can make out of that. What we're lacking is the capability to refine in huge volumes raw oil um, that'll produce petroleum for cars and that kind of oil. So, the more we can invest in our capability to refine all types of oil and byproducts of oil, the more powerful we'll become in the global economy. And with some of the Arab nations, one, I forget who it was, actually said we're no longer part of OPEC. We're going to go on our own. Well, Prime Minister Carney was absolutely right in Davos in saying that the old world order is done. And with the dissolution, if OPEC dissolves, what's going to become of the oil market globally? So the more that Carney can do for Alberta in strengthening it, along with Smith, with the cooperation of British Columbia and the First Nations people, I think it'll be better for everybody, coast to coast, right across the board. And I'm very hopeful that all of this investment of time and money by the federal government will demonstrate to Albertans that, you know what, we know you're pissed. You've been screwed over for decades by governments. And let's not forget that the Conservative Party was in power for almost 3 terms. And they continue to screw over Alberta. So, you know what? I continuously call this the Liberal Party 2.0. It seems that they're dancing to a different tune, and that tune is to several provinces right across the country, with a significant focus on Alberta. When do we not hear something from the news cycles about Canada trying to do something with Alberta and for Alberta? And I'm really hopeful that when people go to the polls for the referendum, they do see that, they do recognize it, they do see progress, and then with some recognition from Ottawa, and well, only time will tell. Maybe a lot of folks have their heels dug in the ground, and they're not going to be changing no matter what. They're focused on separation, just like people here in the province of Quebec.
Right. Now, just before we wrap up this conversation, there was a comment that the last comment on the screen about Canada should not allow import of crude oil. If that were the case, the provinces would be clamoring for pipelines. I covered the Energy East hearings in St. John, New Brunswick, back when that proposal was on the table. And it made all the sense in the world. But it got choked off at the Quebec border, Ontario-Quebec border, in the New Brunswick-Quebec border, because at the time Quebec did not want it running through social conscience, didn't want to risk the spill of oil spills, pipeline ruptures, explosions, or whatever. There was a list. But when you look at the safety of pipelines in this country, and you and I have had this discussion in the past as well, they're safe. And even more so as technology improves, safe. So what has happened over the years? We didn't get a pipeline to the East Coast, to the country's largest refinery, the largest and most modern refinery. We didn't get a pipeline there to have Western oil. So then they start bringing some of the oil by rail.
Mm-hmm.
And we know what happened there. That didn't prove to be so safe. And when I used to look out my window at home and see the super tankers sitting offshore waiting to come into the distribution point, all of that oil was coming from the Mideast and Venezuela. All of that money was going offshore. When if we had had a pipeline, for example, or pipelines going east, we would have had that money being reinvested, a large chunk of it being reinvested right back into the country, just buying the product. That did not happen. And where do we find ourselves today? The refinery in St. John is scrambling to find oil supplies. They've started buying oil from Hibernia off Newfoundland and Labrador again. However, their big issue is finding tankers and leasing them. There's a shortage of tankers up for lease. So then you've got that compounded. Why we didn't see this coming, some kind of a disaster like this, supply management disaster, coming when we were talking about Energy East is beyond me. And maybe it was included in the binders after binders. But the full focus was on the environmentalists and in Quebec, and it just choked it off completely. And again, I've said this before, and I'll say it again, and I'll keep saying it until somebody actually lets it sink in a bit. You can't just shut off the oil supply tomorrow to save the world, because the world runs on oil. Everything you touch. This is going out to all of you environmentalists. Everything you touch on a daily basis, in some way, shape, or form, has been touched by oil. And you might as well get that through your heads. It's going to take a long time to move, and we're slowly starting to move in that direction to reduce the use of fossil fuels. But you just can't turn the tap off like some of them want to do, like the Stephen Guilbeaults of the world and others. It just can't happen. It's not realistic. Anyway, what is our takeaway from all of this discussion? Well, separation in Canada may no longer be a two-player negotiation. It's becoming a multi-party constitutional reality.